When are you going to get a real job? Gerald Sinclair asked his son-in-law across a table full of untouched pot roast, in front of his wife, his other son, and the daughter who had married this man against her father's quiet but very clear disapproval. Marcus Reyes set his fork down, folded his hands, and said nothing at all. He didn't know yet that in 11 days, the army would call him to stand at attention over Gerald Sinclair's own father's casket, and that Gerald would finally understand exactly what kind of job his son-in-law actually had. Marcus was 30 years old, 6 years removed from active duty, and for the past 3 of those years, he had served with the state's military funeral honors detail. A small, disciplined unit of soldiers whose entire job consisted of one solemn task performed with absolute precision, over and over, for families who had lost someone who once wore the uniform. He folded flags. He presented them. He fired the volleys. He played, on the days he was assigned the bugle instead of the rifle line, a version of taps so exact and so aching that more than one grieving widow had told him afterward it was the only part of the whole funeral she remembered clearly. To Gerald Sinclair, none of that amounted to what he considered a real job. Gerald had built his own career the old-fashioned way, starting as a floor salesman at a single-car dealership at 19 and working his way, over 3 decades, into ownership of 4 dealerships across 2 counties. A life built on quarterly numbers and closing ratios and the specific satisfaction of watching a bottom line grow larger every year. He measured a man's worth the way he'd been taught to measure everything else in his professional life. By output, by income, by the kind of tangible, countable success you could put on a spreadsheet, and Marcus Reyes's job a modest state salary, no commission, no bonus structure, no ladder to climb toward anything larger, simply didn't register on Gerald's scale as anything worth respecting. He'd said as much, more than once, over the 4 years since his daughter Emily had married Marcus, sometimes directly, more often in the careful, deniable way people say cruel things while technically remaining polite. Playing dress-up for the government, Gerald had called it once, at a family barbecue, loud enough for half the yard to hear, marching around in a costume while real men build something. Emily had gone pale and started to respond, but Marcus had simply reached over, squeezed her hand under the table, and let the comment pass. The way he let most of Gerald's comments pass, because Marcus had learned a long time ago, in circumstances far heavier than a backyard barbecue, that some battles cost more than they were worth fighting in the moment. Marcus had grown up the son of a long-haul truck driver and a hospital custodian, neither parent college-educated, both of them proud in a quiet, unglamorous way of a son who'd enlisted at 18 and served 8 years in the infantry. 2 of those years overseas in a stretch of deployment Marcus rarely discussed with anyone outside his own small circle. He'd come home from his second deployment changed in ways that took him years to fully understand, carrying a particular heaviness around the specific memory of a young private in his squad. A 19-year-old named Danny Ortiz, who hadn't made it home at all. It was Danny's funeral, attended by Marcus in his dress uniform 3 weeks after they'd flown his body back, that had quietly redirected the entire second half of Marcus's career. Danny had been the youngest soldier in Marcus's squad, barely out of high school, a kid who talked constantly about a girlfriend back home and a used motorcycle he'd been saving up to buy. The kind of easy, unguarded warmth that made an entire squad feel a little lighter just having him around. Marcus had been the one to write the letter to Danny's mother describing, as gently as the truth would allow, the circumstances of her son's death. A letter he'd rewritten 11 times before he felt he'd gotten it close enough to write. And he'd flown home for the funeral still carrying, somewhere behind his ribs, the particular guilt every surviving soldier carries about a death he couldn't prevent no matter how thoroughly he understood, intellectually, that there had been nothing more he could have done. He remembered standing in the honor cordon that day, watching the funeral honors detail perform their duties for Danny with a precision and a gravity that had struck Marcus, even through his own grief, as something close to sacred, the exact, unhurried 13 folds of the flag. Each fold representing something specific, something the detail sergeant murmured under his breath the whole time, though only Marcus, standing close enough, had caught the words. The flag, folded into its tight triangle, presented to Danny's mother with words so carefully chosen and so gently delivered that the woman, who had been sobbing uncontrollably moments before, went suddenly, completely still, holding that flag against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the entire world. Marcus had decided, standing in that cordon, that this was the work he wanted to do. Not despite his own grief, but because of it, because he understood, in a way most people never had reason to understand, exactly how much it mattered to have that final ceremony performed with total, unwavering respect. And he wanted, for the rest of his working life, to be the steady hands that gave grieving families that specific, irreplaceable gift. He'd applied for a position on the state's military funeral honors detail the year after his own discharge, gone through months of rigorous ceremonial training that most civilians never realized existed, drill precision measured down to fractions of an inch, marksmanship certification for the volley rifles, hours upon hours of flag-folding practice until his hands could execute all 13 folds. Blind, in complete darkness, without a single motion wasted. The training had nearly broken him more than once, not physically, though the physical standards were demanding enough, but in the specific emotional toll of learning to hold absolute composure while simulating, over and over, the exact ceremony he'd once watched break his own heart at Danny's funeral. His instructor, a weathered master sergeant named Boone, who'd performed literally thousands of services over a 20-year career, had told the incoming class on their first day that the job would ask them to give a piece of themselves to strangers, over and over, without ever asking for anything back, and that the soldiers who lasted in this work were never the ones who learned to stop feeling it. They were the ones who learned to feel every bit of it and hold their composure anyway, because the family in front of them needed that composure more than they needed to see a soldier's own grief on display. Marcus had washed out of the program once in his second month, overwhelmed during a live practice ceremony by a memory of Danny's mother that hit him mid-fold. Hard enough that his hands shook, and he had to step back and let another soldier finish the sequence. Boone had pulled him aside afterward, not to dismiss him, but to tell him, plainly, that the moment he'd just failed was actually the exact proof Boone needed that Marcus belonged in this work. Because a man who felt nothing had no business folding flags for grieving families in the first place. Marcus had gone back the next day, and the day after that, and by the end of his training he could execute the entire sequence with the same steady hands, regardless of what memory happened to surface mid-ceremony. A discipline he'd carried into every single service since. He'd learned to play taps on the bugle with a technical precision that took most musicians years to develop. Though Marcus had never touched a musical instrument before enlisting, driven instead by sheer disciplined repetition until the 24 notes came out of him clean and true every single time. Because a family standing at a graveside deserved a taps that didn't crack, didn't waver, didn't add one more moment of pain to an already unbearable day. Emily Sinclair had met Marcus during his second year on the honors detail at a mutual friend's engagement party, and she'd been drawn to him immediately, though not, she would tell people later, because of anything to do with the uniform. It was the quiet in him that pulled her in, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he seemed to weigh every word before it left his mouth. A stillness she found she'd never encountered in any of the louder, more ambitious men her father had spent years quietly steering her toward. She worked as an elementary school teacher, a profession Gerald privately considered similarly unremarkable, though he at least extended his daughter's career the courtesy of never saying so out loud the way he did with Marcus's. Their life together, 4 years in, had settled into a rhythm neither of them would have traded for anything more glamorous. Marcus was up early most mornings, running through a private ritual of stretching and quiet reflection before his shift, a habit Emily had learned not to interrupt, understanding it as the specific way her husband prepared himself to carry other families' grief with a steady heart. She packed his lunch some mornings the way her own mother never had. A small domestic gesture Marcus always thanked her for like it was the first time, and they had a shared joke about his uniform boots, which Marcus polished with an almost meditative care every single Sunday night, regardless of how tired he was. A habit Emily found equal parts endearing and slightly absurd, teasing him that she'd never once seen a man treat footwear with that much reverence. They didn't have children yet, a fact Gerald brought up with increasing frequency, as though Marcus's income alone were the deciding obstacle, though the truth, one Emily rarely explained to her father in full, was that they were simply waiting, deliberately, until Marcus's promotion track solidified, and until Emily finished the additional certification that would let her move into a school counseling role she'd been quietly working toward for 2 years. They were, in their own unhurried way, building precisely the kind of stable, deliberate life Gerald claimed to want for his daughter. He had simply never once asked enough questions to notice. They married 2 years later, a modest ceremony at a small chapel that Gerald paid for with visible performative generosity. The kind of generosity that came with an unspoken ledger attached, and Emily had known, walking down that aisle, exactly how much convincing it had taken to get her father to attend at all, let alone smile through the photographs afterward. The tension between Gerald and Marcus never fully resolved itself over the 4 years that followed, not for lack of Emily's effort. She'd tried, more than once, to explain to her father the actual scope of what Marcus's job involved: the training, the precision, the emotional weight of standing at attention over a stranger's casket several times a week, absorbing a piece of every family's grief and somehow, impossibly, finding the discipline to hold his own composure steady enough that theirs didn't have to. Gerald listened, nodded politely, and returned, inevitably, to some version of the same core complaint. "It's admirable, sure," he'd say. "But admirable doesn't pay a mortgage, Em. What happens when you two want to have kids? Is he going to fold flags his whole career, or is there an actual plan in there somewhere?" There was a plan, as it happened. One Marcus rarely discussed, because he'd stopped expecting Gerald to actually listen to it. Marcus was 2 years from full retirement eligibility on his state pension, had been quietly investing a portion of every paycheck since his first year on the detail, and had recently been approached about a senior training role within the unit, overseeing the certification pipeline for new soldiers joining honors details across the region, a promotion that came with a meaningful salary increase, and a role Marcus found more meaningful than almost anything he could imagine doing instead. He hadn't shared the promotion news with Gerald yet. Some part of him, tired after 4 years of being dismissed, had simply stopped seeing the point in offering information to a man who'd already decided what conclusion he wanted to reach. The Sunday dinner where Gerald asked, in front of the whole family, when Marcus was going to get a real job, fell exactly 11 days before the call that would change everything. It had started, that particular Sunday, as an ordinary enough gathering. Emily's mother Diane fussing over the pot roast the way she fussed over every dish she served. Emily's younger brother Tyler scrolling through his phone at the table in the specific way 24-year-olds do when they've decided a conversation doesn't concern them. and Gerald holding court at the head of the table about a new dealership location he was considering. A topic he returned to with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely couldn't imagine any subject more interesting than his own business expansion. It was Tyler, oddly enough, who lit the fuse that evening, mentioning offhand that a friend of his had recently attended a military funeral and been struck by how moving the whole ceremony was, glancing toward Marcus as he said it, a rare small gesture of genuine interest from the one member of the family who usually kept quiet about these things. "That's actually what Marcus does," Emily said, seizing the opening with visible hope. "The flag folding, the honor guard ceremony, that's his whole job." Gerald set down his fork with a small, deliberate click against the plate. "Speaking of which," he said, in the tone of a man who had simply been waiting for an opening rather than genuinely responding to what his son-in-law had just been credited with, "when are you going to get a real job, Marcus? I mean that with respect. You're 30 years old. You've got a wife. You two are going to want a house someday, kids someday, and I just don't see how folding flags for the state gets you there." He gestured vaguely with his fork, an expansive motion that seemed to encompass every dealership, every closing bonus, every measurable marker of success he'd built his entire identity around. "There's no ceiling in it, son, no growth. I could get you an interview at the dealership tomorrow. Sales floor, entry level, but with your discipline you'd move up fast. Real money. Real career." The table went quiet in the specific, uncomfortable way tables go quiet when everyone present has heard some version of this exact speech before and is simply waiting to see how badly it lands this time. Marcus set his fork down, folded his hands on the edge of the table, and said nothing at all. Not right away. He thought, in the brief silence that followed, about Danny Ortiz's mother clutching that folded flag against her chest. He thought about the widow who'd told him, after her own husband's service, that his taps had been the only 40 seconds of that entire week she'd felt like she could actually breathe. He thought about the senior training role waiting for him, unmentioned, in his own back pocket, and he decided, in that quiet moment, that explaining any of it to a man who had already decided the verdict simply wasn't worth the breath it would cost him. "I appreciate the offer, Gerald," Marcus said finally, his voice even, betraying none of what the comment had actually cost him. "I've got a job I believe in. I'll let you know if that changes." "Suit yourself," Gerald said, already reaching for the pot roast again, already moving on, the way a man moves on when he's said what he came to say and doesn't especially care how it landed. Emily reached under the table and found Marcus's hand, squeezing it once. Hard. An apology she couldn't say out loud in front of her father. They drove home in near silence that night, and it was only once they were inside their own small house, door closed against the rest of the world, that Emily finally let her frustration out fully. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I don't know why he can't just see you. I don't know how many more years of this I can watch you absorb without saying something back. He's not going to see it until something makes him see it," Marcus said quietly, hanging his jacket by the door. "Some people only understand a thing once it happens to them directly. I stopped waiting for your dad to take my word for it a long time ago, Em. Doesn't mean it doesn't sting some nights. It does. But it's not worth fighting him over pot roast." Neither of them had any idea, standing in that small kitchen that Sunday night, exactly how soon and how directly Gerald's understanding was about to be tested. 11 days later, Marcus's phone rang at 6:40 in the morning, the specific tone he'd assigned to his unit's dispatch line, a sound that had woken him up hundreds of times over 3 years and never once stopped carrying its particular weight. He answered it standing in his kitchen in sweatpants, coffee not yet made, and listened as his detail sergeant read him the assignment details for that week's service's 3 funerals. Standard rotation, until the sergeant reached the fourth name on the list, and Marcus felt something in his chest go suddenly, completely still. "Sinclair," the sergeant said. Walter James Sinclair. Korean War veteran, 91 years old, passed Tuesday at Riverside Memorial. Families requesting full honors flag, volleys taps, services Thursday at Fairview Cemetery, 1100 hours. Your assigned flag detail and bugle. Marcus stood very still in his kitchen, coffee forgotten entirely, running the name through his memory, searching for confirmation of something he already, somehow, felt certain of before he'd even finished the search. Sinclair wasn't an uncommon name, but Walter, 91, a veteran Emily, had mentioned her grandfather exactly a handful of times in 4 years of marriage, always briefly, always with a specific tenderness that stood in stark contrast to how she talked about her own father. Walter Sinclair had served in Korea, had come home and barely spoken of it for the rest of his life, had lived. In his final years, in an assisted care facility 2 towns over that Emily visited dutifully, but that Gerald, by Emily's own quiet admission, visited far less often than his conscience probably wanted him to. Marcus called Emily at work during her lunch break, his voice carefully controlled in the way it got when he was trying not to let emotion outrun the facts before he had them confirmed. He said. "Was your grandfather's name Walter? Walter James Sinclair?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Emily answered, her voice already catching. "He passed Tuesday. My dad called this morning. I was going to tell you tonight. I didn't want to interrupt your shift with Marcus. Why are you asking me that specifically?" "Because I just got assigned to his service," Marcus said quietly. "Flag detail and bugle. Thursday, 1100 hours, Fairview Cemetery. I'm going to be the one standing over your grandfather's casket. I'm going to be the one handing your father that flag." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Marcus checked his phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Oh my God," Emily finally said, her voice thick. "Marcus, oh my God. Does my dad know it's you? Does the family even know who gets assigned to these things, or is it just random?" "Random," Marcus confirmed. "Nobody requests a specific soldier. Your dad's got no idea who's showing up Thursday. All he knows is a detail is coming. He doesn't know it's me until I'm standing there in front of him." Emily was quiet again for a moment, and when she spoke next, there was something steadier in her voice, something that sounded almost like anticipation breaking through the grief. "Marcus," she said, "I think you need to just be exactly who you always are on Thursday. Don't soften it. Don't make it easier on him. Just do your job the way you always do it. I think he actually needs to see it, all the way through. I think this might be the only thing that ever could have shown him." Walter Sinclair had been a quiet man his entire life, by every account Emily had ever given Marcus, a man who'd landed in Korea at 19 years old and come home 18 months later, carrying things he never once fully unpacked for his own family. He'd built a modest hardware store instead of Gerald's sprawling dealerships, content, by all appearances, with a smaller, steadier kind of life than the one his son eventually pursued so aggressively. Emily remembered him fondly from childhood summers, a grandfather who taught her to fish and rarely raised his voice, a man whose own quiet dignity Emily had told Marcus, more than once, felt like something Gerald had somehow inherited none of on his way to building an empire of car lots. Gerald's relationship with his father had been complicated in ways Emily only partially understood. A distance that had opened somewhere in Gerald's 20s and never fully closed. The specific quiet estrangement of a son who'd decided, early on, that his father's modest hardware store life represented a ceiling he had no intention of accepting for himself. Walter had never once criticized Gerald's ambitions directly, but Gerald had always sensed, correctly or not, a quiet disappointment in his father's steady, unhurried satisfaction with so much less than Gerald wanted for himself. And somewhere along the way that perceived disappointment had curdled into a kind of defensive distance Gerald never quite managed to name, let alone repair. Walter had attended Gerald's dealership grand openings dutifully over the years, had shown up to Emily's and Tyler's childhood milestones with the same quiet reliability he'd brought to everything in his life. But the two men had rarely spoken about anything beyond the weather and Walter's health in more than a decade, an entire relationship reduced, by the time Walter passed, to a handful of surface-level check-ins neither man seemed to know how to deepen. Emily remembered, as a teenager, overhearing her father on the phone with Walter more than once, the conversations always brief, always slightly stiff, ending with the same formal, distant take care of yourself, Dad that never seemed to carry the weight either man might have wanted it to. There had been a particular Christmas, years earlier, when Walter had tried, in his own quiet way, to bridge the distance, pulling Gerald aside after dinner to tell him he was proud of what he'd built, that he hadn't always known how to say it, but that he'd watched his son work harder than almost anyone he'd ever known. Gerald had thanked him stiffly, and changed the subject within a minute. Uncomfortable, Emily always suspected. With a tenderness he'd never quite learned the language for, and the two men had gone right back to their careful, surface-level distance for the remaining years of Walter's life, an entire relationship's worth of unspoken things quietly accumulating on both sides of a gap neither one ever found the courage to close. Thursday arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp blue autumn morning that makes a cemetery look almost peaceful despite everything it holds. Marcus arrived early, as he always did, running through his equipment checks with his detail team in the honor guard staging area, the rifle volley team going through their own final preparations nearby. Marcus's bugle case open on the tailgate of the transport vehicle while he ran silently through the 24 notes in his head one more time, the way he did before every single service, regardless of how many hundreds of times he'd played them before. He'd told his detail sergeant privately, before the service began, about his connection to the family, offering to be reassigned if it would be more appropriate. But the sergeant, a steady veteran of the detail himself, had simply asked Marcus one question: could he hold his composure through the full ceremony, regardless of the personal connection? And when Marcus answered yes without hesitation, the sergeant had told him to proceed exactly as assigned. Because a soldier who could serve his own family's grief with full discipline was precisely the kind of soldier this work was built to produce. He saw the Sinclair family arrive from a distance, recognized Emily immediately in a simple black dress, standing close beside her mother Diane, and beside them, Gerald, dressed in an expensive dark suit that looked, in this particular setting, oddly small on him. His usual expansive confidence nowhere in evidence, replaced by the specific stooped uncertainty of a man standing at his own father's graveside with more unresolved history than he knew how to carry. Tyler walked a step behind them, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, uncharacteristically subdued, and a handful of Walter's own remaining friends from the hardware store days, elderly men in ill-fitting suits, sat quietly toward the back of the small gathered crowd, the last living witnesses to a version of Walter Sinclair that his own son had never fully taken the time to know. Emily caught sight of Marcus among the uniformed soldiers before her father did, and Marcus watched her exhale slowly, a small, private, steadying breath, before she turned forward again and reached for her mother's hand, the two of them settling into their seats in the front row, close enough now that Marcus could see, even at this distance, the fresh grief still raw and unguarded on both their faces. Gerald didn't notice Marcus at first, positioned as he was among the other uniformed soldiers at a respectful distance from the family. Indistinguishable in that moment from any of the other disciplined young men and women standing at attention nearby. It wasn't until the ceremony itself began, until the casket was carried forward and the family took their seats and Marcus stepped forward as part of the flag detail, that Gerald's eyes finally landed on his son-in-law's face, and Marcus watched, even through his own rigid, expressionless bearing. The exact moment recognition hit Gerald Sinclair like a physical blow. Marcus did not break formation. He did not soften his posture or offer any private acknowledgement, and this, more than anything, was the discipline Marcus had spent years training into his own body, the ability to hold absolute unwavering composure regardless of what personal weight a particular ceremony carried. Because the family in front of him deserved a soldier's full presence, not a son-in-law's private grief bleeding into the moment. He locked his gaze forward, and he began. The rifle volley came first, 3 sharp, precise reports that echoed cleanly across the frost-touched cemetery grass, Diane flinching slightly at the sound the way most people did. Gerald sitting rigid and silent beside her, his eyes fixed now entirely on Marcus. Then came the bugle, and Marcus lifted it to his lips and played taps the way he had played it for hundreds of strangers before. Except that this time, standing over the casket of a man whose blood ran through his own wife's veins, something in the notes carried a weight Marcus rarely allowed himself to feel this fully during a service. 24 notes, unhurried, exact, aching in the particular way only that specific melody could ache. And by the third phrase Diane was openly weeping, and Gerald, for the first time in longer than Emily could remember, had tears running freely down his face, without any attempt to hide or control them. Then came the folding of the flag. Marcus and his fellow soldier moved through the sequence, with the same unhurried, exact precision Marcus had practiced blind in the dark 1,000 times over. 13 folds, each one deliberate, each one carrying its own quiet significance that most families never learned the specifics of, but somehow felt anyway in the sheer gravity of the movement itself. Marcus's hands did not shake. His breathing stayed even and controlled. He folded that flag into its tight, perfect triangle, the exact same way he had folded hundreds of flags before it, for strangers whose names he never fully learned, and he brought it to rest against his chest, blue field and stars outward, and he turned, and he walked the measured 7 steps toward Gerald Sinclair. He knelt. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, Marcus said, his voice carrying clean and steady across the quiet cemetery. Please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. He placed the folded flag into Gerald's hands, and for a long moment, neither man moved. Gerald staring down at the tight triangle of fabric, now resting in his own palms, then up at his son-in-law's face, still fixed in that same controlled, dignified composure Marcus maintained through every single service he'd ever performed, composure that Gerald, in that exact instant, finally understood was not the absence of feeling, but the deepest possible expression of respect a person could offer another human being's grief. Gerald's hands began to shake. He clutched the flag against his chest the exact way Danny Ortiz's mother had clutched hers all those years earlier, and a sound came out of him that Emily had never once heard her father make in 30 years of knowing him. Something raw and unguarded, and entirely without the polish he usually wore into every room he entered. Marcus rose, executed a final precise salute, and stepped back into formation. The ceremony continuing around him with the same unbroken discipline it always carried. though something in the air of that cemetery had shifted permanently, and every person present, whether they fully understood it yet or not, had just watched a father's entire understanding of his son-in-law come apart and rebuild itself in the space of 11 measured minutes. Gerald found Marcus afterward, once the formal proceedings had ended and the small crowd of mourners had begun the slow process of dispersing toward their cars. Still holding the folded flag against his chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they're afraid to set down even for a moment, he crossed the frost-touched grass toward his son-in-law, and for the first time in 4 years of knowing him, Gerald Sinclair looked, standing in front of Marcus, genuinely uncertain of what to say. "I didn't know," Gerald finally managed, his voice still rough from crying. "I had no idea I didn't know it was like that." "What you do, I've been calling it dress up for 4 years, Marcus, and I just watched my own father get more dignity in 11 minutes than I think I've managed to give him in the last 20 years combined." "It's not about dignity you give somebody in the moment," Marcus said quietly, still in uniform, still carrying himself with the same measured composure, though something softer had entered his voice now that the formal duty was complete. "It's about the dignity that was always there, the whole time he served, whether anybody around him ever fully saw it or not. My job's just making sure that gets honored properly at the end, so the family standing there knows it mattered. All of it. Even the parts he never talked about." Gerald looked down at the flag in his hands again, turning it slowly, running his thumb along the tight fold the way a person touches something they're afraid might disappear if they look away from it too long. "He never talked about Korea," Gerald said, almost to himself. "Not once. Not in 91 years. I used to resent that when I was younger. Thought it meant he didn't trust me enough to tell me. Took me until about 5 minutes ago to understand it probably had nothing to do with trust at all. Most of the men and women I serve never talked about it either," Marcus said. "Doesn't mean it wasn't the most significant thing they ever did. Just means they carried it quietly, the way a lot of the best people do." He paused, choosing his next words with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. "I never got the chance to ask your father a single question about his service, Gerald. But I got to give him this. And for whatever it's worth, I don't think that's a small thing to have gotten to do, even if it came through circumstances none of us would have chosen." Gerald looked up, and, when he looked back up, something in his face had rearranged itself entirely. "I asked you when you were going to get a real job," he said, 11 days ago. "At my own dinner table, in front of my whole family." "You did," Marcus said, no bitterness in it, just plain fact. "I was wrong," Gerald said, and the words seemed to cost him something enormous to say, a lifetime of measuring worth by a single narrow scale finally cracking open in front of his son-in-law's calm, steady presence. "I measured you by the wrong yardstick. I've been measuring you by the wrong yardstick for 4 years, and I don't think I ever would have understood how wrong I was if you hadn't been standing right here today, doing for my own father exactly what I just watched you do." "Apology accepted," Marcus said. "Wasn't necessary, Gerald, but I appreciate it anyway." Diane, watching the exchange from a short distance away, came forward and embraced Marcus tightly, thanking him in a voice thick with fresh tears, and Emily, standing beside her mother, caught Marcus's eye over Diane's shoulder, and something passed between husband and wife in that single look. 4 years of quiet, patient endurance finally, unexpectedly, arriving somewhere worth the wait. Marcus called his old instructor Boone that same evening, a habit he'd kept up over the years whenever a particularly heavy service left him needing to talk it through with someone who understood the specific toll of the work better than anyone else in his life. He told Boone the whole story, Start to finish, the Sunday dinner comment, the assignment call, the 11 measured minutes that had apparently rearranged an entire family's understanding of him. Boone was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line before responding. The same unhurried quiet Marcus remembered from every debrief they'd ever had together. "You know why that ceremony worked on him the way it did?" Boone finally said. "It's not because you're his son-in-law. Plenty of family members watch this ceremony, and it doesn't move them that way, not all the way down. It worked because you never once let your own history in that family change how you did the job. You gave that man's father the exact same 11 minutes you'd have given a total stranger. That's the whole secret of this work, Marcus. The moment you start giving somebody less because you're tired, or somebody more because you're trying to prove a point, you've lost the entire thing that makes it sacred in the first place." Sounds like you didn't lose it. Sounds like that's exactly what finally got through to him. Marcus thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning Boone's words over the same unhurried way he turned over every hard truth in his life. And he came to understand, more fully than he had even in the moment itself, that Gerald's transformation hadn't really been about Marcus proving anything at all. It had simply been about a man finally being allowed to see, clearly and without interference, work that had been worthy of his respect the entire time, whether Gerald had been paying attention to it or not. Gerald did not become a different man overnight. Marcus wouldn't have believed it if he had, and he wasn't especially interested in a conversion story that arrived too fast to be real. But something genuinely shifted in the months that followed. Gerald began asking Marcus real questions. Actual curiosity replacing the dismissiveness that had defined every previous conversation. Wanting to understand the training, the discipline, the emotional weight of a job that required a person to absorb a piece of grief from strangers several times a week, and somehow keep enough of himself intact to do it again the next day. He drove out to watch one of Marcus's services from a respectful distance one afternoon. A stranger's funeral this time. No family connection at all. Simply because he said he wanted to see the work again with new eyes, and he stood at the edge of that cemetery afterward. Quiet for a long time. Before telling Marcus that he finally understood why nobody who did that job well ever needed it to pay. Like a dealership. Marcus accepted the senior training role not long after, a promotion he finally told Gerald about over a dinner that felt, for the first time in years, entirely comfortable, and Gerald, hearing the salary figure attached to the role, had the grace this time to say nothing about it at all, beyond a simple, genuine, "I'm proud of you, son." A sentence Emily later told Marcus she'd never once heard her father say to anyone outside his own children in her entire life. Tyler, who had sat mostly silent through 4 years of his father's dismissiveness toward Marcus, found himself unexpectedly moved by the whole affair, showing up at Marcus and Emily's house a few weeks after the funeral with an entirely uncharacteristic question. Asking whether the honors detail was still accepting applications, whether a 24-year-old with no military background could ever qualify for that kind of work, or whether it required prior service first. Marcus explained patiently that most positions did require a service record. But he found himself, over the weeks that followed, fielding an increasing number of genuinely curious questions from his brother-in-law. Questions that eventually led Tyler to a recruiter's office of his own accord. A development that struck Gerald when he found out, with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet reckoning, about exactly how differently he might have raised both his children if he'd measured a meaningful life by a different yardstick from the very beginning. There was a particular Tuesday, some months before the Sunday dinner confrontation, that Marcus often thought back on, a day that captured better than almost any single story he could tell exactly what his job actually asked of him. He'd performed 3 services that day. Back to back, driving between cemeteries in the detail van with barely enough time to eat a sandwich between ceremonies. The first was for a 94-year-old World War II veteran, whose entire surviving family consisted of a single elderly niece who cried through the whole thing alone in a folding chair. No one else left to grieve alongside her. The second was for a young soldier not much older than Danny had been, killed in a training accident stateside, his parents so shattered they could barely stand upright through their own son's service, needing Marcus and his fellow soldier to essentially anchor the entire ceremony around their frozen grief. The third was for a Korean War veteran with a large, warm, extended family who sang his favorite hymn spontaneously at the graveside, an unplanned moment Marcus had learned over the years to simply hold space for rather than rush past. 3 completely different families, 3 completely different shapes of grief, and Marcus had given each one the exact same unwavering precision and presence. Driving home that night, Bone, tired in a way no dealership sales floor could have produced, and he'd told Emily over a late dinner that nights like that were exactly why he could never explain the job to her father in a single sentence at a Sunday table. It wasn't one job. It was 3 or 4 entirely different acts of care performed in a single afternoon, each one requiring him to set aside everything of his own and give a grieving family the full, undivided weight of his attention. And there was no spreadsheet in the world, Marcus had told her, that could properly measure what that actually cost a person to do well, day after day, year after year. The following Memorial Day, Gerald asked if he could come watch Marcus work an actual service, and Marcus arranged for him to stand, at a respectful distance, during a funeral for a Vietnam veteran whose family had specifically requested full honors. Gerald stood through the entire ceremony in silence, and when it ended, he found Marcus afterward and simply said, quietly, "I used to think a real job was measured by what it paid you. I think now it might actually be measured by what it costs you to do it right, and what it gives back to people who can't ever properly repay it. I don't know why it took me so long to see the difference." Marcus still folds flags for a living, still plays taps with the same disciplined precision he's carried since his very first service, still kneels in front of strangers several times a week, and delivers the same 11 words on behalf of a grateful nation. But these days, on the rare Sundays his father-in-law joins the family for dinner, Gerald introduces him differently to new acquaintances, no longer with the careful, dismissive vagueness of a man embarrassed by his own daughter's choices, but with a plain, unadorned pride that carries more weight than any sales figure Gerald ever built his own identity around. "This is my son-in-law," Gerald says now. He serves with the military funeral honors detail. He folded the flag at my father's funeral. It's the finest thing I've ever watched a person do. Some jobs measure their worth in commission checks and closing ratios. Others measure it in the specific, unbearable weight of a folded flag, pressed gently into grieving hands, and the particular stillness that settles over a person the exact moment they finally understand what real honor actually costs, and what it's worth.